Welcome to the Legal Insurrection Podcast, and we're here with your updates for the week of August 12th. In this episode, we're going to cover a handful of things. We have an update on Operation Demoralize, which is something we've been talking about pretty frequently. How Kamala is still not taking interviews from the press, their run-out-the-clock strategy, and much more. My name is Kimberly Kay. I'm the editorial and operations director of the Legal Insurrection Foundation, and I'm here with our president and founder, Professor Jacobson. So let's go ahead and jump on in. I feel like I open every single episode this way, but every week, I don't even know if it's my expectation that it's not going to be crazier, but it's definitely crazier than the week before. Because we're seeing things that I have just never seen, at least in public, in my lifetime. But first and foremost, I know this is something that we've talked about. I think it's one of the most important things that we are discussing that I don't think enough people are discussing, especially in this election cycle, and it's Operation Demoralize. And so it's something we do. If you have not been to, or if you have not frequented any of our online events, we are not the kind of people, we are not the kind of organization that just complains about things. We pride ourselves in being happy warriors, about keeping our heads up in the fight, being real about the circumstances and what we're seeing, but also doing what we can to take part and spreading the good news wherever it may lie. And so I'm going to turn this over to Professor Jacobson just to kind of give an update on what that looks like for this week. And it might be helpful because I know that you have done a couple of hot takes on Operation Demoralize. And if you're only tuning into our weekly installments, please be sure to check those out. You can find them in all of our podcast channels. But if you could just kind of briefly discuss what Operation Demoralize is and what the updates are there.
Sure. Well, Operation Demoralize is something that a name I came up with at least 11 years ago, because that's the first time I wrote about it, which has to do with the media and the polling and the Democrats creating a false narrative that the election is over, that there's nothing Republicans can do, the momentum is against them. And it happens every presidential election. The first one I wrote it about was 2012 election, where, basically in August, it was announced it's over. Now, of course, Obama did go on to win. So the fact that they're trying to demoralize people doesn't mean that they don't have a lead, but it's never as bad as they present it. And I wrote about that and talked about that a couple of weeks ago on the podcast, and it got a very strong response. And a lot of people on Twitter responded to me that, my God, I didn't even realize I was going through that. And that's what's happening. And so it's only gotten worse in the last couple of weeks as the polling averages have moved towards Harris's favor. But I want to keep things in perspective. She is up 1.1% nationally in the Real Clear Politics polling average. Now, put aside whether you like polling averages, whether you believe them, you don't believe them, we do at least have a measure of comparing cycle to cycle. 1.1% is up now, and it's over, she's going to win. Oh my God, Trump needs to change course, etc. In August 14th of 2020, Joe Biden was up 7.7%. On this date, 1.1% versus 7.7%. And in this date in 2016, Hillary was up 6.8%. So the point I'm trying to make is keep things in perspective. These polls in mid-August are basically garbage. Maybe the polls a week out from the election mean something as all the pollsters become afraid they're going to be embarrassed, so they actually do real polling. But what's happening now is a lot of message polling. And so don't fall for it. Shake out of it. Go about your business. This is going to be a close election, and don't fall for Operation Demoralize.
Yeah, and I love that. I love everything about that. And I think it's so important to take everything with a grain of salt, to really understand that everyone's pushing something here. Everyone's trying to prove something. And it's not always the truth. In fact, it's usually not the truth. So keep that in mind. I mean, we have to be real with what we're dealing with, but keep that in mind and keep your head up and don't give up. Just because
Yeah, just
things look dark.
by way of example, when right before Joe Biden dropped out, I don't have the numbers in front of me, but the public polling wasn't catastrophic for him. Um, but their internal polling obviously was catastrophic for them. So don't believe the public polling. Don't believe what the pollsters who want clicks are telling you. Don't believe what the big news organizations who want attention are telling you. The campaigns have internal polling. They told Joe Biden it was a disaster, even though the public polling wasn't saying that. Now the public polling is trying to convince you that it's a disaster for Trump when it's not. Doesn't mean he can't do better, doesn't mean he doesn't need to adjust, but don't fall for it.
No, it's excellent points. And thank you. Thank you for that update there. Let's talk about Kamala not taking press interviews. Um, I thought this is pretty interesting to me because I don't remember, I'm not saying it hasn't happened, but I do not remember a candidate, especially someone like her, who supposedly is the first of a whole litany of checked boxes, that is not willing to speak directly to the press. I mean, she is being handled and managed at every single step of the way. And in the face of the criticism for not taking any questions, it looks like they're actually doubling down on this and saying that this is not a bad strategy, which, I mean, if we're being blunt, it's probably in her best interest that she's not taking questions because she can barely read off a teleprompter, much less answer questions on the fly. Now we're not sure of her ability to do that because we've never seen her unscripted. What do you think is behind that? Why do you think that they're not letting her speak directly to the press?
For the obvious reason that she would mess up. She's a horrible candidate. She had to drop out before the first caucus when she ran in 2020. She has flub after flub. She comes across as a moron, as somebody who is completely unfit for almost any job. And that's why they don't put her in front of the press, even though the press would ask her softball questions. Um, but I think it's something more. So that's the reason. They're basically pursuing the Joe Biden basement strategy on steroids. They want the race to be about Trump. They didn't want it to be about Biden, and they don't want it to be about Harris. And so they are doing that. And I think that I must have made a good point because your dog liked it. Um, and one thing I saw that was, I thought, very perceptive is that it was Dan McLaughlin, who goes by Baseball Crank on Twitter, said that Harris is running a strategy, is Harris's strategy of running on nothing and answering nothing looks very savvy now. But if she loses, they may look back at this period with regret at the hubris of trying to run out the clock in August. And that's what I feel she's doing. They believe they are up, they believe they are going to win, and they're running out the clock. And we've seen it in sports all the time that you have a team that's up by 3 touchdowns and it's the third quarter and they start trying to run out the clock and it backfires on them. And I think that's what she's doing. I think they have convinced themselves that they have the upper hand, they have the momentum, and all they have to do is run out the clock. That's very dangerous in August. And he points out in a later tweet that that is a strategy campaigns usually use in the last week or two when they are convinced they're going to win. They go silent in the last week or two and try to run out the clock, not 2 months before. So it's a very risky strategy. They're trying to run out the clock. They're trying to hide her. And they have, of course, a compliant press, but the question is, will it work?
I mean, I think obviously it remains to be seen. Not that that's some, profound observation here, but what it does tell me though, that if they're willing to pull, I mean, that's your Hail Mary. And if you're going to throw your Hail Mary in the middle of August, when we're this far in advance um, of the election, they don't have a lot of aces up their sleeve, and I mean, to me, that's what it signals. if they're having to go to those links so soon. And I mean, I don't see how it goes well for them, but like we've talked about repeatedly, we can never underestimate anyone in this whole political game because you just never know what's going to happen. I think an interesting pivot for them too, and another signal that I think it's just sad for the Harris campaign is that rather than coming up with any kind of ingenious policy idea, something that would appeal to the masses on their own, they went out and ripped off one of Trump's talking points, something that he's hammered on for ages, about not taxing tips. And they're just, I mean, shamelessly so, passing it off as their own policy idea, and acting like any blowback from the Trump campaign for the fact that they completely ripped this off is somehow in bad faith. When, I mean, it's a great idea if you've ever worked in a situation where you are making tips and are required to report your tip income. It's not fun. You worked hard for that. You get paid in cash, and it stinks, but you are required to report that as income. But it just seems like it's also such a strange thing to me to choose, because it's a very, I mean, I'm not sure, I did not research what percentage of the workforce makes tips or relies on tips for a substantial portion of their income. But I can't imagine that it's so much that it would massively move the needle, unless they're really trying to dial into a younger demographic that would think this is like the best idea since sliced bread. I mean, I know that she released this policy when she was in Nevada, which of course you have all the casinos, you have all of the cocktail waitresses, you have all these people who make very good money. Most of it is in cash, but it just seemed like a very odd thing to pluck out of the ether to take a stand on.
Well, I think it was a lot of Nevada. It was Vegas. That's where it was announced. But, you know, yes, it's cheap to steal what had been Trump's line for 2 months running. That was a big point he was making. But I also think it shows how confident her campaign is. They can steal in plain view, and they know that they're not going to get called out about it in 90% of the media. And so they can do strategic things like that. If the roles were reversed, if Harris had been touting some policy or some plan for 2 months at almost every speech, and all of a sudden Trump came in and not only adopted it, but made it seem like it was his idea, you would have round the clock major media screaming at him about how he's stealing her idea. You don't get that here. And this is another example that Democrats in these national elections operate at a very different level and in a very different context than Republicans. She will not get scrutiny for that. She will be praised for it. And they can operate and do those outrageous things. And what's particularly outrageous about it is she was part of the administration that passed an IRS plan that focused on taxing tips and collecting
Yes.
tips. Think of the goal of that. She not only steals his plan, she not only makes believe it's her plan, it's the exact opposite of what the Biden Harris administration has been doing when it comes to
Right.
tips. She's not going to get called out on it. It's just, it's bad every cycle, but it seems to be particularly bad, particularly early this cycle.
Well, I mean, and it's easy to walk out onto the field with a different kind of swagger when you're the one setting the rules for the field, and then everyone has to catch up to you. When everyone who's commentating, everyone who's judging, like all of the variables are 100% within your control, almost completely, and walking out that you have your opponent at a disadvantage. And so I think it's part of the reason why they approach these types of elections very differently than Republicans do. The unmitigated disaster of Tim Walz. I know we didn't have an episode last week. That was in part we started school and are trying to readjust to school life. Even though we do homeschool, it is a big adjustment from summer. But so we haven't really talked about this much. Um, but Tim Walz, I mean, almost as soon as he came out of the gate, it's scandal, 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 scandal. And he's probably one of the most scandalicious picks that they had available. Yet they went with him anyway. I mean, there's just so much to discuss here. Um, I think one of the things that I find most concerning, though, of course, the issue of his stolen valor has probably been one of the worst of the controversies surrounding him now that he's on a national stage and not just a statewide stage. And I know that we care about things like that. You know, there are many people in this country who care about stolen valor, who care about people doing things that are dishonest, and especially dishonest in terms of military service. But I'm not sure how many people care enough for that to be a problem. Um, I mean, I know that we've written about this too, about why would they pick him. Van Jones in particular had talked about um, how this is a very sad and almost frightening move for the Democratic Party, that they caved to the darkest, most left wing entities of the party to pick someone who just sat around and watched it all burn during the BLM riots. I mean, what are your initial thoughts on this? And does this help or hurt the Harris campaign by picking him?
Well, I think there's, if the objective is, first do no harm in picking a vice president, this is doing a lot of harm. Whether it's not going to swing California to Republicans, but it could be important in certain swing states. Compare what he did over really a political lifetime of lying about his service and exaggerating it and making dozens of statements which, if not outright lie about serving in war, uh, certainly give the impression that he served. So he was a very tricky guy. I don't like this guy at all. I knew he was a bad guy when, in his first appearance with Kamala Harris on stage, when they announced him, he started snickering and making comments about what is an internet hoax about J.D. Vance. Okay, for those of you who don't know, the internet hoax that he had sex with a couch. Okay, it's literally a hoax. It's more of a hoax than Jussie Smollett. Okay, and here's this bum, this stolen valor bum, who gets on stage and jokes about it, knowing it's a hoax. Okay, so I don't like this guy. I didn't like him from the get-go. It's really the first I'd heard of him. He's a bad guy. When you look at all these clips, this is a really bad guy, extreme leftist, um, and just an arrogant SOB. He really is. And I don't speak that way about a lot of politicians. I don't speak that way about Harris. Got my criticism. I didn't speak that way about Obama. Okay. But this is a really bad guy. And people need to know that. He's a tricky guy who, over a lifetime, lied about his service and exaggerated it with very careful language, where he would juxtapose his National Guard service with attending a funeral at an in Afghanistan or in Iraq. He just really, and he didn't actually say he served there, but anybody listening to it would think that's what he's saying. So I don't like this guy. He's terrible. He should do serious damage to the ticket. Imagine if they picked Josh Shapiro. I mean, we'd be arguing over some policy or something, but
Right.
this guy Walt is a bad guy. And I think he's going to do real damage because it gives Republicans something to attack without Democrats being able to play the race or the misogyny card on them. And it also matters to people. It matters to people Democrats don't care about, that who take this sort of stuff very seriously.
Well, and I think too, kind of as I mentioned earlier, what really surprised me with this is that, like we've discussed, Harris is a progressive. She's not a Democrat. She's a progressive, and there's a difference. She comes from the progressive wing of the party, and I assumed, wrongly, apparently, that she would select a vice president for the ticket, or a vice presidential candidate that would balance out the fact that she is very, 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 very left leaning. Find someone more centrist to make people more comfortable with the fact that she's headlining the ticket. And instead, they went the opposite direction and went way into the fringe to find someone who has major problems. And as you mentioned, I mean, we're not squabbling over percentage of interest rate increases right now, or Social Security. We're not talking about the things that, the boring policy points that we usually discuss during election cycles. We're talking about a guy who has kowtowed to, and like let have run of his city, run of the state, the worst parts of society, these very dangerous groups that have a lot of money and power behind them, who go into these cities and they wreak havoc and they destroy property. People are hurt, and he's giving them carte blanche to do this. And so to have someone who's already doing that on a state level, on a national platform in any capacity, is very frightening. It's very problematic. Um, and it should give even traditional Democrats, I would imagine, um, significant pause to have such a progressive far left ticket. But again, I mean, we're not going to have major polling institutions polling that. They're not going to be asking that question, is this too far left? That's not something anyone wants to talk about out loud, at least in that segment of the political realm. So it might be a post-mortem depending on the outcome of the election, but that's not something that I anticipate will be talked about prior to the election for obvious reasons. Another thing I wanted to discuss is the Harris campaign going in and editing Google search ads. So we have all kinds of crazy Google changes throughout this election cycle. We first had news outlets who were whitewashing headlines for her, who were going back, who were trying to pretend that the things that she said last year, 2 years ago, 3 years ago, 4 years ago, they were trying to pretend she didn't say those things. But because the internet exists and because people know how to find things on the internet, we're able to disprove major media outlets in their claims that she was definitely not the kind of candidate that we all know that she is. But this, I think, is a very different issue altogether, because this is not the media running interference for her this time. This is her campaign going in and manipulating Google search ads to appear far more favorable for her. And I don't know, the irony of all of this, it's just such a twisted web that Axios was one of the ones who was whitewashing for her, and then they're the ones reporting that the Harris campaign is involved in all of this. I know it's something we have covered on the blog, so if this is something you're just hearing about or something you want more information on, everything that we discuss in the podcast you can find at legalinsurrection.com. We've written about this and linked to all of this. So, I mean, what are your thoughts on that? And I mean, obviously the motivation is pretty clear, but what does this mean going forward? I mean, we're already in a situation where it's very difficult to trust the media, to trust anything they say, because we know that, again, as we've discussed, they're whitewashing everything on Harris's behalf. And now the Harris campaign is going into Google and manipulating Google and the Google ads. So I really don't know where this leaves the average American who's just trying to find information, and how you can rightly and easily discern the truth of some of these things.
Yeah, well, I think it's just another example that the Harris campaign believes they can get away with anything. They believe they can steal Trump's policy idea and present it as their own. And they think they can manipulate Google ads to create fictitious headlines that make her look good. And so anything's going to go in this election because they know that the media is going to cover for them. And that was one reported by Axios. And then what happened? The reporter gets attacked, and all of a sudden she starts acting, oh, well, it's not necessarily illegal. okay, so it's not illegal, but it's corrupt, it's immoral, it's deceptive, it's misleading, it's disinformation, it's all of those things. Just because someone's not going to go to jail for doing it doesn't mean it can't be criticized and called out. And that reporter, is so typical. She, you know, did a, as Rush used to call, she did a random act of journalism, okay, and now she's walking it back. And so it's just an
Yeah.
embarrassment, but it goes to show you the Harris campaign thinks they can do just about anything and get away with it. And they're operating in a media environment. Every media, every election, we say, my God, this is the worst media we've ever had. And that may be true. I think with each cycle, it gets worse and worse. And I think it's worse this time. I think it is really bad. The usual media bias that Republicans are up against is at a level that one of the campaigns thinks they can do just about anything. They can hide their candidate. They can refuse to have her appear on news programs. They can refuse to let her take questions. They can steal the opponent's ideas and present them as their own. They can manipulate Google ads to create fictitious headlines. They think they can do just about anything because they're operating in a media environment that, you know what, they pretty much can.
Yeah, I mean, there's zero accountability, which is obvious, but the stakes are so very high in this. You have someone who is being completely shielded and sheltered from any public scrutiny whatsoever. I mean, we saw this horribly with Obama. He was sheltered in ways that I think were, for the first time, incredibly obvious. But um, when you have a situation where you're trying to select someone to be in the highest office in the land, at least as an elected official, and we're not getting any sense of who this person really is because the press is trying to make them appear to be someone they're not. They're not talking to the press unless it's something that's completely scripted, premeditated, pre-decided. And then I'm sorry, my dogs. If it's not the children, it's the dogs or the chickens. But this is always someone. There's just always noise. Um, but there's so much at stake, and we don't have a clear picture of who this person is. We have old reviews where she has incredibly progressive policy that she's talking about, like we've discussed in previous episodes, getting rid of ICE and defunding the police and ending fracking and all kinds of things like that. She's someone who's an accent shapeshifter and who changes her accent no matter where she is. But we have no sense of really who she is. There's no one really speaking up on the national stage about who she is as a person. And policy is one thing, but I think we've seen this time and time again that ultimately what's really going to matter when you're sitting at that table ready to push a button is your character and your decision making capabilities. And we know nothing about, like, truly we don't know enough about her, how she would handle things, and any attempt to try and discern who this person might be at every step of the way is being changed. Like in real time, the entire digital record is being changed in her favor, which means, there's clearly things that are tremendously problematic, or there would not be such a concerted effort to make her appear to be something she's not. That's really what that tells me. Um, so I don't know. I think, headed into this next week, we have the DNC. I'm curious to see how that pans out. We know that a lot of the anti-Israel groups are planning to protest. We know going into the fall that we'll probably see all the campus nonsense pick back up, and even worse, especially because there seems to be zero check, zero accountability on these groups on campuses or anywhere. No one wants to stand up and tell them to shut up and go home. And so we're not just looking at chaos in an electoral season. I think we're going to see chaos in a lot of other ways, unfortunately, because in an absence of leadership, that's just what happens. On a microcosm, it happens in a home when the parents aren't present and dealing with their children, the kids turn into brats. And the same thing happens on a larger scale too. And I don't know. I continue to pray for our country, and I hope that whatever the plans are for disruption and chaos and disaster and destruction, that somehow something happens and causes them to be halted, so that at least innocent people aren't caught up in this, that small business owners don't have their businesses completely obliterated over these astroturf protests that I think we can expect to see in the coming weeks and just leading up to the election. Do you have um, any thoughts there? Any concerns there?
No, I think it's going to be a hot fall. I think that the student groups are emboldened by what they got away with last year. And, I think it's going to be hard to keep a lid on things. And so it's going to be what it's going to be. But I just think people need to stay focused. And I don't think it's in the Democrats' interest to stoke the violence the way they're doing, but it's who their base is. It's what they're about. So I think that whether it's the Trump campaign or Republicans, have to just keep pushing their message and not rely on what's going to happen in the greater society, because I think it's going to get extremely, extremely ugly. Trump was almost assassinated, came within a millimeter of being assassinated. And unfortunately, I don't think that violence, against Republicans is over.
No, I agree. I think we're ramping up into some unfortunate and gross times ahead. So keep your chin up. That's why it's even more important to be aware of what Bill calls Operation Demoralize. Keep your chin up. If you are the praying sort, definitely pray for our country and our leadership, because your prayers do matter and they do work, whether you believe that or not. I know it's true. So I think that's all we have for this week, but we look forward to coming back to visit with y'all or chat again next week. For more information on this episode, you can find it at legalinsurrection.com/6. And thanks for tuning in to the Legal Insurrection Podcast. And we will talk to you soon.
Take care.